And you were live.
Okay, good morning, everyone. This is meeting of Senate Rules, Wednesday, the 25th of January. And the reason we're meeting today is about, at the simplest level, it's about the room capacities that are posted outside of each of our committee rooms. This reevaluation stems from a complaint that we had from Press Corps. They sent our office a letter, and what they're concerned about is under the posted capacities currently, a number of the rooms run up quickly against capacity, in which case we've tried our best to preserve press access, but there were a couple of moments where there were some minutes here or there where the press was not able to get into a room. And I don't want to minimize it. We want the press to have access always. So Ashley and I and Secretary Bloomer and others have been working over the last couple of weeks to try to figure things out. One thing we already have done, the Rules Committee was consulted on, and that was restoring the pre-COVID press situation in the chamber. So we're back to where we were with access for the press on the floor. So if we're in recess, they're allowed to be moving on the floor with their cameras, and then the television cameras limited to the front corners. So that, I think, was a good change. Similarly, we've been re-examining the capacity limits. The posted capacities were put in place just when we came back to the State House. There was understandable trepidation about crowding in the rooms. So those posted capacities were smaller based on a kind of social distancing principle. But having re-examined them, I discussed with the chairs last night the possibility that we should go back to room capacity limits that were developed by BGS and the Sergeant at Arms.
Using HVAC science.
Yep. And it's called the ASHRAE calculation, which is the professional designation for how they calculate square footage and air handling capacity within that space. And yeah, oh, I got this. Thank you.
Oh, I didn't text them.
Okay.
I just know the first bullet point is no longer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And
Senator Brock should be receiving this from Vanessa.
okay, Randy, you've been emailed these from Vanessa. So hopefully you can pull those off. So let me go to this grid first. So as I said, ASHRAE numbers are an airflow analysis, and you can find that on the website. Those numbers, there's a strict calculation that produced them. One of the things we were told is that if you think about our rooms and you look up to the ceiling right now, you can see that a lot of the space in these rooms is unusable because it's so far above our heads. On the ground, we've got obviously desks, tables, etc. So the second list of numbers, Sergeant at Arms numbers, what that was the Sergeant at Arms and the Chief of Capitol Police, with consultation from fire marshals, going into the rooms and trying to determine whether those ASHRAE calculations were practically usable on the floor plan. And so you'll notice that the Sergeant at Arms adjusted numbers are just slightly smaller. The only place where they're markedly smaller is Senate Health and Welfare. Other than that, it's a 1 or 2 seat difference.
And the Senate chamber.
And the Senate chamber.
Yes, there's a little difference there. Whoa.
Yeah. And the Secretary assures us that the Senate chamber has the best air handling in the building. So
That's 50 total, count the senators, so it's 30, 20.
That would be their numbers that based a little bit on spacing. With
Well,
the
that
air,
would count our number 30, so it's 20 people extra.
but in the air quality itself will handle 171. It's really a
Oh,
spacing issue.
wow.
Yeah.
It's got the best air, I think, in the building, practically.
So
Plus we'll be open the windows.
what we discussed at the chairs meeting last night was moving from the numbers that are now currently posted to one of these two sets of numbers. And the chairs were exactly evenly divided on what they thought. And I made clear to them that it was an advisory vote and that the authority to do this rested with Rules Committee. So that's what I bring to the Rules Committee this morning is these two sets of numbers. The ASHRAE numbers are the scientific air handling analysis numbers. The Sergeant at Arms numbers were adjusted slightly by Chief of Police and the Sergeant at Arms in consultation with fire safety people. So that's the first question that we're looking at is, first question is, do we agree that we should move away from the lower currently posted capacities to these numbers? And if that's yes, then which of these two sets of numbers do we select? I will say that the ASHRAE numbers, that's a pure scientific calculation. In that sense, it's very easy, should someone question it, to point them to the study, which is linked below. The Sergeant at Arms adjusted numbers had the advantage of there were three sets of eyes looking on the actual rooms and the floor plans, trying to figure out whether those air handling numbers made sense in real life. And so, questions or discussion?
Yeah, I think we should go to adjust the numbers from where they were, because those were based on other sets of facts that are different now. And I would go by the Sergeant at Arms numbers if those are fire, safety numbers, because if there was a fire and not everybody could get out fast enough, I wouldn't want to be held responsible for saying that we were told only 13, but we put 15 in the room. So, and since it's, unless a chair feels like, oh, I really need two more, they would have to work with the Sergeant at Arms to change their room in a way to meet that requirement.
Yep. Awesome.
So I would agree with Andy. Having served on the State House Committee when we discussed these initially, that was meeting for the last, in the last biennium that was looking at the renovation of the State House and COVID, how we adapted the State House for COVID. We discussed this at great length. And what I like about the Sergeant at Arms numbers is that they take the scientific recommendations and then apply them to the physicality and reality of each room.
Mm-hmm.
I actually, looking at this and knowing that there are 9 people in here, you think of an additional 9, how many more in probes? Let's see, 22. I mean, so that's a lot of people additionally when you think about all the seats. So they were looking at people in seats and just how it works in each room. So I like the Sergeant at Arms numbers because it's the science applied with the reality of the physical layout of each room.
Mm-hmm.
Are we basing it on the COVID, or are we basing it on fire safety, or that would be my question?
Well,
Yeah.
I would say it's still both. If you pick
Matrix.
the Sergeant at Arms numbers, it would be both.
Well, that's Sergeant at Arms is also taking into consideration the air quality.
Yeah. Yeah, so the Sergeant at Arms did their best to stay as close as possible to the ASHRAE numbers, but with some practical adjustments.
What happens to the Senate? 50, so 50, that would be no one allowed in the Senate.
Well,
21.
that might,
Yeah, but you got the staff. You got staff there. You got 30 us, and you got what? Half of the staff.
So, I mean, I guess, yeah, I'll try. So generally speaking, we do not have a capacity limit currently on the Senate chamber. We have spacing as to where they can go and it's sort of seats. And so I think from our perspective, at this point, I don't know if you have to address numbers in the Senate chamber. If you just wanted to do your discussion on the committees, we'd be fine. We've never, it's hard to get over 60, no matter what happens. With your 30 in the seats, there's probably 20, and we could possibly put some on the floor. Currently, we're not allowing many people on the floor unless it's a necessity. We start at the back.
How many seats upstairs? I mean, how many seats?
There's probably, if you squish people, you could probably get close to 20 in the
Is there
two
seating up
buildings.
there for 20?
Yes, there is.
Okay, so 20. 30, 50, and then you gotta figure the staff.
We had more than 50 there during the openings of the session.
Okay.
Yeah, many.
So we, I mean, I don't know if you, it's up to you to decide, but right now we have not been anticipating a capacity limit for this session.
And we haven't posted a limit on the chamber, so as far as I'm concerned, we're not voting to change a limit because there isn't one.
So we will be discussing committee rooms and not the chamber?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, that's.
Same with the lieutenant governors.
Okay, yeah.
Obviously, what you do-
Yeah, I think of that as outside our purview.
Right, yeah.
So, other thoughts on, well, let me ask it this way. Is there anybody who wants to remain with the current posting?
No,
Okay, so we're at the question of which, it seems, we have 2 votes for the sergeant at arms numbers for.
Fine. It's not much difference.
Okay, Randy, your thoughts?
Question. I have not received the detailed, I'm assuming it's a detailed room by room. What I've received is a draft letter and an email from Chrissy.
Okay,
But
so
my question,
you don't have this grid, Randy?
I do not have the grid, but let me just, I understand the issue and I've got really the fundamental question. And that is in the sergeant at arms recommendation, which I assume is lower than the air handling recommendation for certain rooms.
Yes.
yeah, but only by 1 or 2.
All right, and the rooms are by 1 or 2 at the most, and they're low, and they're based and presumably something in writing rather than simply an arbitrary number written down as to why they made that decision, so that there's a rationale that can be explained.
I think in talking with the sergeant at arms, they don't have a link to give. They walked around and adjusted the numbers based on the conversation they were having. I don't know, Randy, that there's a document that they can point to. And that's honestly, that's one of the advantage of the ASHRAE numbers is that there is a study if somebody wants to go look at it. But we'd be basing it on the expertise of the sergeant at arms, the chief, and the fire safety folks.
Well, I guess the only concern I have is that there will be a claim made that those numbers that we are using, if we use those numbers, are arbitrary and are not scientific, whereas the numbers presented by ASHRAE are, and there's a basis that that can be defended. That's just the only concern that I have in thinking about it.
Allison?
So, Randy, I understand where you're coming from, but I also understand that they're kind of arbitrary too, not taking into account how the rooms are laid out, where the chairs are, so it's, I appreciated the chief and the sergeant at arms coming in and actually sort of truthing the scientific numbers with our own architecture and layout. So I think it's, I think it's sort of a combination of the two, and they're just very modest differences. I mean, the biggest differences I think is in health and welfare.
Yeah, that's of course.
Where there are 4 seats, but the rest, in many cases, they're exactly the same.
Well, the question is this: are there any circumstances in which the sergeant at arms number is in the other direction?
No.
No, because they're.
So what we're doing is we're saying, for both of these, we are saying the lower of the evaluations by the 2 groups of evaluators is the number that we are taking.
Yeah, that's fair.
And in all fairness, we'd have to have Janet and Matt come in and chat about it to tell you how they came at this. But as I recall their presentation to the State House Committee, that is what they did. They took the ASHRAE numbers, the HVAC numbers, which remember account for a lot of space we don't use, but which is useful in terms of health, and truthed it with what's on the ground.
Okay.
And how we can function in the room. So, and what's here, the furniture, the space, the architecture, and they balanced it. So we'd have to hear from them if you wanted any further understanding of the science they applied to it, which was permitting and understanding all those physical realities of the space, of each space.
I would just want to make sure the air is the important factor here.
Oh,
That's when we started off, this whole conversation was air.
Right.
That was my concern.
Yeah, and that's the basis of both sets of figures. It's just that
And the air handling number or capacity, is that based on air handling in a normal set of circumstances or air handling in the era of COVID? Is there a different standard that might be applied?
It's the HVAC as it exists now in these buildings. And the problem is our HVAC system isn't being replaced until this summer. And we have poor HVAC in a large part of the Senate. It's spotty. So we have great HVAC in the chamber, in the Senate chamber, but not great in a lot of the rooms.
Well,
And
my question is this: in determining what the number is, the correct number is for people in a room, is the basis of that for people in a normal situation or people during the era of COVID? Is there a different number for those calculations?
Randy, as it was explained to us, this is air handling writ large. So it's not limited to COVID.
Okay.
It's air handling problems of other sorts too. People complain of being sleepy in the afternoon, and there are rooms where we believe that has to do with poor HVAC. So this was an attempt to look at HVAC beyond COVID, although that's one factor.
ASHRAE stands for the American Society for Heating, Refrigeration, and Engineers. Yeah,
Engineers.
heating, refrigeration, and air conditioning engineers. It's about, my understanding is about oxygen.
Okay.
So that's why you use that space, because
Yeah.
you can use. So it's about oxygen levels and what's a healthy oxygen level and air exchange for that oxygen. So that I don't think they changed that for COVID.
Right.
So just gonna, this original study was done pre-COVID. And so some of the original numbers were put out, I think it's in a January study before COVID. And then there was Freeman and French went through, and then they did the spacing, they did a second report. So the ASHRAE numbers are air oxygen numbers. They do not relate to what the correct amount of oxygen or space is for COVID.
Okay, so with that said, and Randy makes a good point, does anybody want to redo their vote? So I think we had 3 people in favor of the Sergeant at Arms numbers. Randy, your thoughts? I don't want to assume where you're going.
Well, I would say I would just like to see something documented regarding the Sergeant at Arms number, so that there's something in writing that gives us a basis for doing it. That said, if we in fact get that, I would be inclined to go with the Sergeant at Arms numbers.
I like that.
And I don't see that Janet would have a hard time doing that. It might be her, her memory of what they did, but she would check with the chief and the people they
It's
consult.
something that articulates the basis for the decision.
Yeah. Okay. And with that said, what would your vote be, Randy?
My vote would be to use that number, the Sergeant at Arms number.
Sergeant at Arms. Okay. I would concur. So I think I'm looking around. That seems to be 5-0 for Sergeant at Arms numbers, with the caveat that we'd like some documentation to the extent possible at this point from Sergeant at Arms office about how the numbers were arrived at. Okay, with that said, if folks could just quickly look at the other document, the members of the Vermont Press Corps. This is a draft letter that we've put together. The first bullet point would be replaced by what we just did, which is this first bullet point was an attempt, if we were keeping the currently posted numbers, how we might deal with it. But having found out that we want to go to the Sergeant at Arms higher numbers, we don't need that first bullet point. We'll replace that with an explanation of the Sergeant at Arms numbers for capacity. Then the rest of these are mostly just reminders of proper protocol to chairs, not discussing policy when the Zoom camera is off, making sure the door is open when the Zoom cameras are off. If there's a quorum, designate a seat for the press.
But the door should be open if the Zoom camera is on.
If there's a quorum in the room. So in other words, one of the complaints that we had was that people wind up outside And it's not so much that they're outside the room as that the door is closed and the camera has gone off and they feel like there's still things being
So if the
discussed.
camera's off, the door has to be.
Right.
You know,
And there's a quorum. So, it's a, it's a thing where we will do our best.
Who supervises it? I mean, the clerk, our staff person will.
Yeah, in the same way that the staff and person and the chair coordinate going on Zoom.
Okay.
So the chair typically says, okay, let's go off live. And then the staff person turns off the camera. They should get into the habit of saying, let's go off live and open the door.
But as far as putting a note on the door when it's reaches capacity, that's the staff person that will have to do that, or?
Well, Peggy, in talking with Peggy, she doesn't want staff people to be tasked with monitoring that. So she still thinks it should be the chair who communicates that the room is full.
So we have to make sure when we have to do the count and tell someone to go and put this.
yeah, we've been asking whoever's closest to the door to put it.
Okay, no, I'm just trying to figure out a policy for everybody. We all
Yeah.
share the same concerns.
Yep.
Who's responsible, how we keep the count, because when someone leaves, okay, now we can allow one more in.
Yeah. And that should go away, I hope, with these higher numbers. You shouldn't have the same anxiety about a person coming in or a person coming out. But yeah, Peggy doesn't want the committee assistants to be tasked with telling people they have to leave. She feels like that's the chair's responsibility. So if we could just go to the last, because this is in some ways the fail-safe mechanism. So having adjusted things on the floor for press, having adjusted the room capacities, the fail-safe is if following that a press person still feels improperly excluded, I'm directing them to immediately go to Ashley. She will find me wherever I am, and I will mediate the dispute in real time. Because the problem with the last three is that I had no idea they were happening. The chairs that they happened with didn't feel like there was an issue. There was no tension, there was no confrontation. It was, let's, adjust for a few minutes. But it turned into the perception that we were locking the doors, which I don't think was true. But to make sure that we don't miscommunicate like that with the press, I want to be there in the event that a reporter feels excluded, and I will make sure that they're in the room, and I'll figure out how to do that on the fly in that particular room, depending on who's in there and what the capacities are, et cetera. Randy. Oh, you're muted, Randy.
As I'm reading through the letter, I see that there can be a change in the capacity limit to move to some undefined number of people in the room who would be masked.
No.
Is that, am I
Randy,
reading that correctly?
Well, you missed what I said. That bullet point is being eliminated and.
Okay,
replaced
all right, fine, thank you.
with
That's
what we
okay.
just-
That's what I wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so, Allison?
Yeah, I'm just curious. I don't recall us having a designated press seat ever before. So I'm not quite clear. I mean, legislative council, yes, we have a designated seat. But this is a new policy to have a
And-
designated seat in
and-
press.
Honestly, that's my idea, and if it goes against the will of the Rules Committee, I'll eliminate it. It seemed to me, so in other words, as we do with Ledge Council, if there's no press person in the room, anyone can sit in that seat. But in the event that a press person needs to come in, the person who's occupying either same with the Ledge Council, when they're in the room, they get that seat. And we'd have at least one seat for the press. That would be a floor, not a ceiling. So we wouldn't be saying you can only have one seat. But it seemed to me a gesture that would
We
speak
did that in
to their.
Senate
concerns.
education.
Yeah,
When you first came back from COVID last year, this was our recommendation. Maybe it wasn't as explicit to everybody, but the recommendation from the Senate Secretary's office that some rooms only have two rooms, that one be for the press, one be for the public. Both were being treated equally. Our opinion is that neither one of them was given some sort of preference. And so that our recommendation, when the numbers were sort of lowered, that they go no lower than committee staff members in 2. And so this, I've explained that to Senator Brew, but this was our recommendation from last year, and I think all chairs followed it after there was one issue. And that was really to make sure that both segments, citizens and press, had an ability to sit in the room before and after the camera went. So that this, the genesis was actually done last year.
So just follow up, if you're in the middle of a debate and a discussion in the committee and somebody comes in, we don't know who all the press people are because they change with some degree of regularity. How are you supposed to know they're a press person, A, and B, I think that's a little challenging when we're in the middle of things.
Yeah.
In theory, I suppose this is a nice way to start and see what the issues are. But I think press don't always identify themselves.
True enough.
Often they don't. And so I think it's putting a tough onus on a chair who may not know who the press person is.
Well, and we're doing our best. So,
Yeah, so we can try this and see if it works.
and just importantly, if you look up in the the second paragraph, I say that we will revisit these policies at the town meeting day break, as we are going to do with the rule, that temporary rule for people to zoom in emergencies.
I think that makes sense.
I think the last paragraph addresses your issue, Senator, and that's, we used that similar policy a couple times last year. I can give you the committees where there was a press person who wanted to go in and wasn't going to pay. They immediately went to the pro tem's office. Carolyn got involved, Senator Ballin got involved, and it was resolved. So I think by including the last paragraph here, if there's a press person who's trying to get in and is for some reason not recognized, can't get in, that the policy at the end hopefully alleviates.
We have to stop the meeting and go down.
No, because you won't even necessarily know.
The press person goes down.
Goes down to Ashley, it's Senator Baruth, and it's whether it's a real press person, not a real press person, who they are. That's sort of the way it was worked through at least twice last year.
The third bullet point doesn't say about the door being open if there's a quorum, which I think is what you said.
Good point.
It should add the quorum piece because
Because I think people shut it all the time, just have whatever conversation, there's 2 or 3. It talks about
No,
quorum
that's the second.
in the second one, but I think
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
we should go and add it to the third.
okay.
should be repeated. And also the door is often closed, particularly here. It's very
loud.
busy, very noisy hall.
Yeah, guess so.
And, we just close it out because it's A, cold, B, noisy.
Yeah.
And so
But I
it
think-
isn't, I don't know anybody in this building who's deterred by a closed door.
Well, what we're trying to do is speak to complaints that were repeated by more than one person. And there was a complaint that the camera goes off, but the door stays closed. They've been told that the room is full. So
Yeah, no, I understand. I appreciate that.
So everyone's got to get to their committees. I think we took the vote we needed to take. The minutes will reflect that. We'll replace this bullet point with that vote that we just took. And I think a copy of this finished letter will go out to the members of the press corps that wrote their letter to us and to everybody in the Senate, saying this is our new policy.
And John just has a quick show and tell follow-up.
Oh, wait, exactly, quickly. I'm very sorry. So we, last time we discussed allowing certain exemptions to the beverage. I wanted to make sure I let you know what we were using in case you saw them on the floor. These are the cups. They have lids as requested by Senator Clarkson. We had some issues where various people wanted to make sure they're recyclable. So what we actually went to is ones that are rewashable. They're not made out of any kind of material. They're metal rather than a paper. And so
We have a seat number on them?
we do have a seat number on. This one does not, because this is being held for Senator Sears, because he has a pre-existing one. But all the other ones have seat numbers.
Then we are adjourned.